challenge of what would be a new normal. And it's a new normal because we're conscious of the fact that it's not going to be exactly what we knew before, clearly. And through this time, I'm sure that to some extent or other, we've all had fears, and we've had an awful lot of change and uncertainty to deal with. I suspect a huge amount of worry. One of my daughters is a nurse, so I completely understand that. And for some of us, there's also been illness and bereavement to deal with. So we've an awful lot to deal with in the last little while. And this wanting to return to normality is really human, but the difficulty we have right now is that actually everything is still feeling really uncertain, really uncertain. So I came across this poll which looked at the sorts of things that we normally took for granted, like eating with friends or going shopping, that focused on just what proportion of the population in the UK were now actually quite fearful about attending and taking part in things that we've previously taken for granted. So 61% of people had significant worries about going to bars and restaurants. I also was really interested, so this poll was taken last week, about how long people think that it will be before things get back to normal. And if you look at that graph, it would seem that most people are thinking that 6 months to a year is potentially how long it will take. The reality is that none of us know, not me, not anyone, and I can't provide you with any specific, with any more answers tonight than you already have. But I just wanted to, I suppose, in a way, begin this by saying that if things feel uncertain and if things feel difficult, it's because uncertainty is actually something that the human condition is not really very happy with. And I thought I'd tell you a little bit more about what we know about the psychology of uncertainty. So there is a sense in which uncertainty comes in different guises. So there is the uncertainty which is about our assessment of the probability or risk of something happening. And then there is also the uncertainty that comes from ambiguity, from our inability to actually be really clear about what's happening. And then the final element is that psychologists have looked at is the uncertainty that comes from the sheer complexity of the situation that we have to take in. And I'm sure you'll agree that one of the reasons that right now possibly we feel the way we do is that the sort of level of uncertainty we experience actually encompasses all three kinds of uncertainty. So we know from research that we actually do need some uncertainty, and actually if we had no uncertainty in our lives, if our lives were completely predictable, then they would also be extraordinarily boring. So we do need some uncertainty in our lives, but we've evolved to reduce uncertainty in our lives as much as possible. And as individuals, apart from adrenaline junkies out there, most people resist order and uncertainty in terms of their everyday experience. And so because we need a little bit of uncertainty, what transpires is that for most of us, uncertainty is kind of best contained. And so by containment, I mean, people watch horror movies and people read books that are kind of have an element of thrill and the suspense about them, or maybe we like the thrill of watching a race or following a team. Some people go for gambling, which is not exactly a very fun way of dealing with of getting your uncertainty, but there you go. And then finally, you kind of have people who really like what to me are just appallingly scary rides that sort of give them that sort of level of uncertainty they enjoy. But when it comes to uncertainty in our everyday lives, it's a different story. And part of the reason for that is because we are constantly monitoring our world and making micro judgments all the time about what's safe, what isn't safe, what's sensible, what isn't sensible. And we are doing that in a way that becomes so much a second nature that we're not even aware that we're doing, but we're making these judgments. So when you decide whether to cross the street effectively, you're monitoring the speed that cars are coming at, that kind of thing. but also in all sorts of other subtle ways you're doing the same thing. And uncertainty is seen as dangerous in evolutionary terms and in human experience terms, because if we can't predict the world, we are so good at predicting. We are constantly trying to predict what's going on. And if we can't predict what's coming, then how can we keep ourselves and our loved ones safe? So uncertainty is something that we have some difficulty with. And indeed, what you find is that people who have anxiety disorders often have something called hypervigilance. And if you're interested in anxiety, then I'm going to talk some more about that next week. What's really interesting for me in all of this is dealing with uncertainty really takes energy and causes stress. So if right now you're finding yourself rather more tired than possibly you were otherwise, just given that you may well be spending quite a lot of time at home, well, dealing with all of this uncertainty and the stress it causes is tiring in and of itself. And if you look at stress, I like this particular definition of stress. It talks about no or unclear information, no control, and uncertainty with a sense of threat, which again feels very much the experience that we're feeling ourselves right now. So what we need to bear in mind is that prolonged stress has the potential to really impact on our health. So it's a good idea for us to think about, well, how can we minimize that stress as we face what is potentially a fairly prolonged period. So I think, just to give you some ideas that you might hopefully use, I think it's really helpful to think of transitions generally in life are quite hard, even when they're happy transitions. So if you think about changing a job, that's quite a stressful experience. So when you change jobs, you have an ending phase where you're kind of leaving your job. You have this in-between phase when you're trying to get to grips with your new place of work. And then you have a new phase where your new place of work feels like your place of work. And actually, it feels like you've been doing this a long time. So how we go through these transitions is something that happens on an individual basis. And how long we spend in each of these stages varies, and that's okay. So that's actually a very individual thing that we each adapt to. So what's in terms of kind of where we are now, what I find really interesting is that although most of the time what we try to do is predict and control events so that they become more manageable and we reduce our stress, actually the research indicates that it's far less effective to try to control the situation and to predict what's going on than it is to actually increase on our ability to tolerate uncertainty and fear of the unknown. So rather than trying to control the situation, that we actually try and control effectively our response to it. And I've named this particular source, but in fact there's lots of research that indicates the same. So some of the strategies that we could potentially utilize to reduce our response to a particular situation, to a particular set of uncertainty, to a particular situation that's uncertain. It is, for example, to do some cognitive strategies, some thinking strategies that are away from emotion, that is about reappraising. So in this particular instance, for example, it may be that we think about, well, what is better? What might be better than was before? So that the unknown and the unknown becomes not necessarily a bad thing. So we might think about, well, how might this benefit? So, for example, from my perspective, I'm thinking, well, possibly travel for conferences across the world might, and for business across the world might be reduced because we've got so good at using technology to run our meetings, and that would be a good thing for the environment. And the way that you might reappraise. I've also heard of people say, well, this has been a moment where I really feel that I've reconsidered what's my priorities, and that actually my family is super, super important, and that I've really enjoyed the time I've spent with them, and I want to continue. And then the other way that you can reappraise is by trying to understand your concerns. And by that I mean, rather than have an overall feeling of uncertainty, that you try and have a moment where you really try and pin down what is actually worrying, what aspects of it are worrying you. So for you. I've had a warning to say that my connection is poor, so I'm not entirely. If anybody is having difficulty hearing me, please say. I'm not sure what I can do, but I'll try and do something. Oh, great. Thank you. I've had confirmation that you can hear me. So we've talked about reappraising. We've talked about improving understanding of what your specific concerns are, rather than just having an overwhelming concern. And so it may be that you can break it down that actually your specific concern in our current circumstance is your travel into work, or some very specific aspect of your work that you have concerns about. The other thing is that right now, because the situation is stressful, it's a really good moment to consider how you cope with stress generally, because the situation is not going to get better immediately. It's going to continue to be like this for some time. So it would be quite useful to think about how you might be able to cope with stress, knowing that it's a part of life and that actually it's a reasonable response, and what you might be able to do to actually reduce your stress. So what I've got here, I took from actually an NHS leaflet. Somebody's just asked about the slides. I'm happy to share the slides with anybody who wants them, but I believe that this will also be posted on YouTube, so you'll be able to see it at your leisure. So we're talking about an ending phase, and an ending phase is actually the first phase, if you remember. So we have ending, and then we have an intermediate, an in-between phase, and then we have a new phase. So the ending phase, which if we are kind of coming to the end of lockdown, it is actually really important to acknowledge. So as you may have found some comfort in lockdown, and if you are in a family situation and you've got children, they may have found some comfort in lockdown, and you have some concerns about returning. And it's really important that you acknowledge that loss of something. It may not have felt at the beginning, you may have felt like a really strange thing, but now you might find that it's actually a loss. And that you take a moment to consider the positive from it and what you can do to hold on to it. So, for example, it may be that your working practices will never be quite the same again, and that your employer will say, well, you can always be able to work some days at home if that's something that's possible for you. I also thought I'd tell you a little bit about this thing, which I think is an interesting concept of re-entry anxiety. So re-entry anxiety is the sort of anxiety that we feel whenever, so for example, if you fall off a bike, the fear that you get when you get on a bike, that's re-entry anxiety. And this is perfectly normal. So having come away from a situation, it's perfectly normal to feel some anxiety about going back. And then the last stage is to actually acknowledge and take your time. And taking your time, I don't just literally means pausing and thinking. I think sometimes we're so busy doing and living that we forget to actually think about the feelings that we're having. So this in-between phase, guess what? I begin with the same thing about taking your time, about not jumping straight back into a routine. Whatever control you have over easing yourself into activities, maybe try and see if you can utilize that control to shape your return. So, for example, I saw a friend for the first time in the last few days, and she was saying that her first step is just to feel comfortable in other people's presence, because actually she's been in lockdown for such a long time, and that's a step. I thought that was a great step. So you kind of build with very few people, and then possibly you sort of build up more. So if you have to go into work, which you may have to, that possibly you can build up your attendance so that you don't go in every day to begin with, or you might need to kind of go in for a few hours and make some hours at home. It depends on how much flexibility you have. And I've said the same for your child, because if you have children and they're going back to school, this is something that you can also perhaps discuss with the school and talk to them about your child possibly being eased back in. I think it's also, again, useful to be honest about your fears, and which is kind of what we talked about in the previous slide, and then to make specific measures, to put specific measures in place that will make you feel more comfortable. But I think it's also really important to acknowledge that you will have moments of struggle. I'm thinking about how I'm going to feel the next time I'm on the tube, and I think it's really important to have a strategy that kind of goes, okay, this moment is a difficult moment for me. So this technique that I've got here is a mindfulness technique, and it really is utilizing the one tool that the one piece of equipment we always have with us, so to speak, which is our capacity to breathe. And so this talks about you just stopping, and that includes stopping the thought that's making you anxious, that you literally plant your feet firmly on the ground and that you feel it touching the ground, you feel them touching the ground, and then that you focus on your breathing and you just let yourself be. There is an alternative one, which I am very fond of, by a psychologist called Mark Williams, and he has some mindfulness exercises, including a 3-minute breathing space, which I downloaded off the web and I find really, really useful. So I don't know how many have children and are trying to support them through this period of transition. Actually, quite a lot of what I'm about to tell you, I think that if you remember that if you look after yourself well and you contain your stress, your presence and support are actually the most important thing that you can do for them. But there are also some strategies. I think talking to children is really important, and talking to them in age-appropriate and simple language, to try and not only honour and accept their feelings, but also to talk about a range of things, the past and the future. And then this final point, which for me is really important. I am, as I said, the mother of 2 daughters, and I can't tell you that there are very few ways in which being a psychologist helps you being a parent, because being a parent is such an emotional thing, but discussing and rehearsing strategies has been a consistent experience that I've had. But also it's to be led by your children. So often children give you clues that they want to talk to you. So for example, they might hover, and so look for clues that they want to talk to, and kind of just address their questions a little bit at a time. So take your lead from them. If they ask a question, answer it honestly. It may be that that's all they can cope with at that particular time. And I am a huge believer in creating opportunity to talk, but I don't mean like face to face. Often what works with children is, of all ages actually, yes, I'm old enough to call children all ages, is to create opportunities to talk, by which I mean you could do an activity together. So you could cook or you could draw, and you're both engaged in the activity, but that can be a really good opportunity to also to let the conversation talk more freely, but flow more freely. And it can be really useful, and it's less kind of overwhelming than to be talking to somebody kind of straight in the eye and very seriously. I think reassurance is important. You don't have to pretend that you know the answers, because at the moment you don't, but what you're saying is that you are there, and that in fact it's really good to model accepting that it's okay not to know everything, but that you have part of a team of people who can work things out with them. They are not on their own. And also to remind them that change is a normal part of life. So regardless of their age, they will have gone through some changes. When children start school, I remember when my daughter started nursery, or when they started primary school, or when they transitioned to secondary school, it felt like the biggest change in the world. So they've come through them before, even if it's that they stayed with a friend or they stayed away the weekend. All children will have had some transition that you can point to their success, and you can say, you did this well before, this week you do this well again. And I think also it's important to know that if your child is struggling, or if you feel that talking about it is actually going to add to their anxiety, that you ask for advice. So you can ask for advice from other parents, you can ask for advice from school, you can ask for advice from your GP if you thought that was appropriate. And then the other thing is to watch for signs of anxiety. And this actually, again, is, I say child in the loosest possible sense of the word. Everything I'm saying works equally well for adolescents. You just have to change the language. But it's, for example, fairly common to see anxious children reverting to what were previous patterns of behaviour. So possibly children who might sort of want to come into bed with you. If they're quite small, they suddenly want to come into bed with you, or might suck their thumb if this is something that they did before. It's perfectly, children who have experiencing anxiety may be more emotionally clingy, or if they're kind of going into school and they're anxious, you might see that they might be inattentive, or they have withdrawals. The crucial thing is that they are supported at each stage, and that you also model coping behaviours for them. one of the things that we talk about on the program a huge amount is how children look at what we do all the time. They are constantly looking at our behaviour, and I think what we do sometimes is as important, if not more important, than what we say. And also to talk with them about having some strategies for when their emotions are overwhelming, as well as the ones that we described for you. I think also, this is kind of coming to the end, this is also something I'll come back to in a few weeks when I talk about resilience. I'm a huge believer in kind of celebrating people's strengths, and especially at times of adversity. We tend to kind of focus on celebrating our own and our children's strengths in ways that kind of are much more commonplace. I think that this particular slide, which looks at some strengths that come from positive psychology research, really are wonderful ways of actually showing to them and to yourself actually that you are coping really effectively, and that each of these things have a place in a time of great stress. And then, although we can't return to our old normal, it's important that we remember that normality will return eventually, and that in fact the new normal may have some positives. I appreciate that some people will have had some awful losses in the last few weeks, but it's useful to kind of think about what the positive might be. And I think the other thing is to remember that we are highly adaptable as human beings. That's how we've survived as a species as well as we have. We are highly adaptable, and that we will get through this. And I think it's worth remembering that that strength is definitely within us, and that your perspective right now, the perspective that you adopt, is actually your best asset.